Gan Facebook, yeah. Well, diolch bwgyn wysio wrth gael ffaith yn siarad Tronona an Vasco here in Hampshire, beis in a yield at Hamalohin, agus an ishtain here in Scala. It's a very mixed May evening, but we have the weather this time in Ireland. We're torrential. I met Thomas, our speaker, earlier on when the torrential deluge was just stopping, and I went for a cup of coffee, and like about 10 minutes later there was steam rising from the pavement and from the tops of buildings. So that's the type. So I'm very, very glad to introduce today's speaker. Today's talk is part of a series planned for the year 2020 to commemorate 80 years of the School of Celtic Studies and the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies. And it was decided that we'd have a series of lectures on early Irish law. But 2020 being 2020, the version of the Buidhe Connell descended upon us, the plague, and of course it knocked everything off kilter for a while. But when I contacted speakers again, they were very, very glad to take up the challenge. And in March, Fergus Kelly gave us a very fine lecture at King's Inns, and this is being followed up today by his friend and colleague of many years, Thomas Charles Edwards. Now, Thomas hardly needs an introduction to an audience such as this. All I say about him is that he's an absolutely terrifying scholar. He's terrifying because of the number of books and articles he has written, and all written terrifyingly well. We can instance the first book in the Early Irish Law series, Bec Bhreatha, which he co-edited with Fergus, and he also edited on his own the latest book in the series, Bhreatha Covathchasa, which was launched at the Tunnel in November last. But beside that, he's also authored tomes on early Irish and Welsh kinship. His great book on early Christian Ireland. He's translated some analytic material for the Chronicle of Ireland. He's another book on the Wales and the Britons in 2013, as well as his and many, many articles on areas such as church history, hagiography, legal terminology, honour and status, the world of St. Patrick, interpretations of early Irish texts, and so on. And as for his books, well, we can say quite honestly, as the Americans might say, he doesn't do small. They're all very substantial volumes, and I have learned quite a lot from them, as I'm sure we all have. So we're very, very honoured and pleased to have Thomas with us today, and he was very, very willing to give the talk. He's a great friend of the Institute, having studied here with Binchy many, many years ago. And the title of his talk today is Early Irish Law, 1910 to 1978, Plummer, Thurneysen and Binchy. So Professor Thomas Charles Edwards, I should have said retired emeritus professor of Celtic at Oxford University.
Thank you very much, Rory, for that. It's always a huge pleasure to be back here, not least in the library, which I find just one of the nicest places to work that I've ever experienced. My title then is on early Irish law in the 20th century, and three people who were long-time students, relatively long-time students of early Irish law, namely Plummer, Thurneysen and Binchy. All three of the students of early Irish law about whom I'm chosen to speak were born in the second half of the 19th century. Plummer, the oldest, in 1851, Binchy, the youngest, in 1899, though he always told one that he was born in 1900, and in such important things as the kind of biographical register of Corpus Christi College, my college in Oxford, he's down as 1900. because he told them so. Anyway, about two of them, namely the oldest and youngest, Charles Plummer and Daniel Binchy, the reasons why I have chosen them are partly, or to talk about them, are partly personal, and partly that there is a vital link between them. One personal reason can be acknowledged at the outset, only to be set aside, for though it matters to me, and actually mattered a bit to Binchy too, it's not intrinsically of huge importance. Plummer died in September 1927 after 54 years as a Fellow of Corpus Christi College, Oxford. He occupied a set of rooms in the Fellows Building there, which Binchy would subsequently occupy from 1946 until 1949, and I occupied from 1969 until 1976. It is no more than a curious coincidence that one set of rooms in the one college, in the one university, played host to three long-time students of early Irish law, out of a total which even now hardly gets into double figures. The curious coincidence, however, points to something which is more important, that for considerable periods in the 20th century, the study of early Irish law was kept going by only one scholar. And that mattered, for as the 6 volumes of the Corpus Juris Hibernici demonstrates, there was all too much text to study by that one scholar. The danger of scholarly isolation was not in fact pressing for Plummer, but serious for Binchy from 1940, when Rudolf Thurneysen died, until the late 1960s. The period before the late 1960s onwards, when there was certain strength in the subject, and there might actually have been the kind of kernel of a community of kind of friends and scholars studying law, early Irish law. That was the early 1920s, when, as it happened, both Plummer and Thurneysen and Owen MacNeill were all working on the subject. Thurneysen was a Swiss German, as we know, from Basel, who in my judgment, and that of many others, was the finest Celtic scholar yet to grace our discipline. He was like Plummer in that both of them came to Irish law late in their careers. Thurneysen, very roughly, had 3 main phases in his career. He began as a philologist, then did fundamental work on medieval Irish literature that Rory has, I think, given the annual public lecture on, and only subsequently came to the laws. Plummer was a classicist as an undergraduate, but turned to history after his election as a life fellow, lovely thing, a life fellow in 1873. He just got in before they abolished such things. He excelled as an editor of texts, above all of Bede's Ecclesiastical History, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and the Lives of Irish Saints, both in Latin and in Irish. So what was most unusual in his day, and indeed since, is that he worked on the sources for both English and Irish history, and also unusually, both in Latin and in the vernacular. Two vernaculars. He came to Irish law first in 1910, the same year as his edition of Latin Lives of Irish Saints was published in 2 volumes. But even then, Irish law was far from taking up all his time. He was, for example, yet to publish a collection of vernacular Lives of Irish Saints, mainly from 2 manuscripts written by Michael O'Clery. What Irish law then existed in print was in a deeply unsatisfactory edition and translation, particularly translation, in 5 volumes with a glossary as the 6th, The Ancient Laws of Ireland. The copy of this edition, which had come out between 1865 and 1901, that now resides in Jesus College, Oxford, was Plummer's. The texts are extensively annotated, mostly in pencil, with corrections and noting of misreadings and mistranslations, notes of which manuscripts the editors had used, and quotations from and references to other manuscript copies, as well as parallel texts. He also continued his habit of noting when he read a particular text. And in this way, we can now see that he was already working his way through the 5 volumes for the first time by July 1910. That he finished this first reading on the 14th of February 1911. He was clearly working fast. And after the First World War, he began a second reading in November 1921, which he completed on the 2nd of August 1922. In the same year that his edition of the vernacular Lives of Irish Saints was published. A third, more rapid reading was completed on the 24th of March 1926, 18 months before his death. When they began working on the laws, both Plummer in 1910 and Thurneysen after Joseph Parch had come to Bonn in 1920 as professor of Roman law. And Parch is a fundamental character in this tale. So that's sort of, for them, the dates when they started. When Parch got to know Thurneysen, they began meeting on a weekly basis, one afternoon a week, to read Irish legal texts. These, of necessity, were texts in the ancient laws of Ireland. The first fruits of their collaboration appeared in 1923, an edition of the tract on what we term base clientship, together with translation and detailed commentary, but limited to the main text of the original, not to the glosses and commentaries in late Middle Irish, early Modern Irish. At the beginning of this edition, Thurneysen explained its origins in the weekly afternoon meetings with Parch, noting that hitherto Irish law had seemed to him to be a book sealed with 7 seals. Quite a popular kind of quotation in references to early Irish law subsequently. In their meetings, as Thurneysen modestly noted, whereas Parch brought to the discussion an extensive knowledge of a wide variety of legal traditions, he himself only brought a modest knowledge of Irish. Now that was a seriously self-deprecating remark from a man whose grammar of Old Irish, first published in 1909, we still use today in a revised English version. The choice of text was fortunate, since base clientship was the relationship between an ordinary Irish freeman and his lord. And the tract is therefore one of the most important texts for anyone desiring to understand early Irish society. So they're really getting into the sort of fundamentals when they chose that particular tract. By the time of his second reading through the ancient laws in 1921 and 1922, Plummer had benefited from the loan from the Royal Irish Academy of a set of the, and I quote, anastatic reproductions of the transcripts made by John O'Donovan and Eugene O'Curry for the Brehon Law Commissioners in numerous volumes. By 1924, at least, Thurneysen had also been loaned a set of these same transcripts. Now, the transcripts by O'Donovan and O'Curry take us back to the origins of the project to edit the ancient laws of Ireland. It had begun with a proposal by Charles Graves, later Bishop of Limerick, and James Henthorne Todd of TCD, that a Brehon Law Commission be established with public funds to publish the Brehon laws. When the proposal was made, namely in 1852, the leading scholars able to work on manuscripts in Irish were John O'Donovan and Eugene O'Curry. They were paid to transcribe and translate the legal texts then known to exist in manuscript. Their transcripts have become known to scholars in the field ever since as the O'Donovan and O'Curry transcripts. And Binchy, in the Corpus Juris Hibernici, gives cross-references to them in the form OC and OD, and the page numbers of the transcripts. Now, these cross-references are still useful today, since O'Donovan and O'Curry copied straight from the manuscripts, whereas Binchy tended to use photographs. I remember coming across one case where there's a fold in the parchment and a letter is concealed in the fold. So someone using a photograph just wouldn't see it. You have to go back to, I forget whether it's O'Curry or O'Donovan, to see what's going on. O'Donovan, however, died in 1861 and O'Curry in 1862, whereas the first volume of the Ancient Laws did not appear until 1865, edited by others with a much less secure knowledge of the Irish language. Right, so thanks, I suspect, to R.I. Best, both of them had acquired, both Plummer and Binchy had acquired copies of the transcripts. A few years after Thurneysen and Parch began their collaboration, another legal scholar, the Russian Paul Vinogradov, then a fellow of Plummer's College in Oxford, Corpus Christi, and professor of jurisprudence in the university, was the person who encouraged Binchy, now in his mid-20s, to take up the study of early Irish law. Binchy at this stage was in Paris. He had already, in 1924, been appointed Professor of Jurisprudence and Legal History at UCD by Dennis Coffey, apparently when they met walking round Stephen's Green. It's one of the sort of nicer moments in the history of our subject. But he'd been allowed to continue working at the premier French institution for training medieval historians, namely the École des Chartes, until 1925. Now, before Binchy left Paris, Vinogradov came to give a lecture. Now, earlier, Vinogradov, who was a seriously broad-minded character in the sort of range that he tried to take on, had attempted to bring early Irish law into scholarly discussion of medieval European law, but being limited to the introductions to the volumes of the ancient laws, had had little success. He had made the odd reference to the Breton laws, but his knowledge of Welsh law was far superior, since the edition of the Ancient Laws and Institutes of Wales, published in 1841, contained a much more reliable translation. Now, however, Plummer had drawn the attention of Vinogradov to Thurneysen's edition and translation of the tract on base clientship. And accordingly, when Vinogradov, let's say, met Binchy in Paris, he urged Binchy to take up the opportunity for real progress that had been conclusively revealed by Thurneysen's collaboration with Joseph Parch. Later, we'll examine how Binchy went about the task that Vinogradov had urged him to take on. But that's a kind of vital little link between Thurneysen, Parch, Plummer, Vinogradov, and Binchy. It's instructive to compare the published work on Irish law of Plummer and Thurneysen. Thurneysen had great courage, partly because he didn't mind too much making mistakes, partly that he was well aware that he was a pioneer feeding his way into understanding early Irish law. So his edition of the tract on base clientship appeared in 1923 in volume 14 of the Zeitschrift für Keltische Philologie, with the first set of corrections in the same volume. 3 other sets of corrections appeared in 1925 in volume 15, because those volumes were not kind of printed all in one go. They were printed parts of it successively. In 2 of those sets of corrections in 1925, he acknowledged improvements suggested by Plummer, presumably by letter. A 5th set of corrections appeared in 1927 in volume 16. You have this whole pleasurable moment when he corrects in volume 16 the corrections that he made in 15 of what he did in 14. Plummer, however, was much more cautious in his scheme of work. His published contributions began in 1916 as a set of notes on some passages in the Bretton Laws. Get serious change of tone of voice from Thurneysen's. And these continued with 4 further sets, the last of which were printed about the time of his death. An article entitled On the Fragmentary State of the Text of the Bretton Laws was published in 1928 after his death. His publications, however, were only part of the story. In the library of the Royal Irish Academy, there are, I think, 15 large boxes of Plummer's slips, recording examples of Irish words. Many of these come from the laws, most from the O'Curry and O'Donovan transcripts, and therefore these slips were made in the early 1920s. Can't have been earlier. After his death, they came to Dublin, to the Academy, to be used for the Dictionary of the Irish Language. Now, the first fascicule of that dictionary had been published in 1913, earlier, just before the First World War, and the second did not appear until 1932. Now, that point was after Plummer's death and after the slips had arrived in the Academy. From then on, references to them appear quite frequently in the published fascicules, and they were also used by Binchy for his work on the law. They were used by a completely different purpose by me in my history, which I did with someone else, of Corpus Christi College, because they very often they note a reference to Curry or O'Donovan transcripts and things on the reverse side of something else. And the something else is sometimes really quite interesting for the historian of Corpus Christi College. Anyway, so Plummer's approach, as you can see, was much more hesitant than Thurneysen's, content to make improvements of detail, though admittedly across the whole range of legal texts, rather than editing particular tracts. One final difference between the two scholars was simply that Thurneysen lived longer, dying in August 1940, aged 83. Plummer had died in September 1927, aged a mere 76. It's rather a comforting thing for those of us who work on early Irish law that, 76 is nothing about it, and never was. Anyway, when Thurneysen came to Dublin in 1929 to conduct a seminar on the early Irish law and the status of women and sexual unions, he was already well retired and aged 72. His last edition of legal texts appeared in 1931 when he was 74, but smaller contributions continued to be published until the year of his death. Thurneysen also developed greater confidence as he went on. Initially, he may well have relied heavily on his much younger colleague, Partch. But Partch would die at the young age of 42 in March 1925. The foreword to another edition completed in 1925 shortly after hearing the news that Parch had died suddenly, makes it clear how much Thurneysen missed his collaborator. No one seems to have replaced him. Yet Thurneysen would publish perhaps his most ambitious work on Irish law in 1928, combining, as was his custom, a text with translation and notes, and also a detailed analysis in a full commentary. He'd obviously learnt enough from his collaboration with Parch to write on his own a full account of the law on a particular topic. Where a manuscript text contained glosses and commentary, that's a late medieval commentary, Thurneysen was now including them also in edition and translation, not just the main text, as with the tract on base clientship. So both in setting out the text and in analysing it, he had made great strides between 1923 and 1925, and had developed even further by 1928. Corrigenda still appeared, but not anything like the scale of the first edited text in 1923. When Binchy returned to Dublin from Paris in 1925 to take up his professorship at UCD, among other things, he was responsible for legal history, and he made up his mind that it would be a most unfortunate start to his professorship if he were to be incapable of teaching anyone anything about the native law of his own country. To become capable, he had first of all to master Irish from the earliest manuscript remains down to the early modern period at least, and his new colleague and fellow Cork man, Osborne Bergin, the professor in UCD, was firmly of the opinion, first, that one should master the modern spoken language as well as the written Irish of earlier periods, and secondly, that Munster Irish was the best dialect for someone wishing to combine the modern with the medieval language. So, Binchy went with Bergin to Dunquin in the Kerry Gaeltacht, and he was already an accomplished linguist. That wasn't the problem. He was proud, among other things, I remember him saying it, of the pure French pronunciation he had acquired from the French nuns who had run a primary school which he had attended. And obviously he had fluent German from his time as a graduate student in Munich. 4 years later, in September 1929, Binchy had leave of absence from his chair in UCD in order to go, as we know, as Irish minister in Berlin. The 26 counties were still a free state, still under the British Crown and part of the Commonwealth. Binchy was therefore minister and not ambassador. One thing that may have attracted him to the job was that he could make little visits to Thurneysen in Bonn. One of the things that he was clearly doing quite a lot of, and was welcome to his bosses back in Dublin, was giving lectures on Irish topics to familiarise people in Germany with Irish matters. Anyway, the National Library in Dublin had just acquired a 15th century manuscript that at the end contained unique copies of two early Irish legal texts, both belonging to to the major Irish law book, the Seanachas Mór. The first of these was on sick maintenance, namely the duty of an injurer to organise and pay for the medical care of the person he had injured. Binchy now undertook to edit it, with an accompanying discussion of the subject. The plan was modelled on the text and study model in the form that was already adopted by Thurneysen in his work of 1928 on suretyship. The edition of Bretha Chordacha and the accompanying study, Sick Maintenance in Irish Law, were published in 1934, 2 years after Binchy had returned from Berlin to Dublin and to UCD. Now, this substantial work of 134 pages took up the first part of volume 12 of ERU, namely the well-known journal founded as the Journal of the School of Irish Learning, a school established, as we know, by Cunha earlier in the century. The timing of the publication shows that much of the spade work must have been done while Binchy was in Germany and able to consult Thurneysen, as well as acknowledging a debt to, the introduction of the edition gives warm thanks to Thurneysen, as well as acknowledging a debt to Plummer and to the latter's slips deposited in the Royal Irish Academy. Although Binchy's work on sick maintenance owed much to the example, as well as the instruction of Thurneysen, and in particular the example of his work on suretyship, it also looked back to the contribution, less evident, of Joseph Partch, the professor of Roman law who had died in 1925. This is evident from the opening sentence of the accompanying article, Sick Maintenance in Irish Law, which I shall now quote. Students of comparative law have long realized that the rules governing compensation for personal injuries offer perhaps the most fruitful field for the work of drawing parallels between ancient legal systems. So, drawing parallels between ancient legal systems was precisely what attracted Partch to Thurneysen. Binchy then went on in the rest of the paragraph to cite examples from biblical, Hindu, and early Germanic law, including the leech fee, namely the fee paid to the physician, which is found in Anglo-Saxon law. All this, however, was only a backdrop to the claim made in the second paragraph. Old Irish law preserves for us, as in many other respects, the relics of a more primitive system. In the earliest texts, we find that the injurer, instead of paying the leech fee, must undertake the duty of nursing his victim back to health and providing him with medical attendance. Now, this claim is wholly characteristic of Binchy's approach. Early Irish law is placed along and amongst other legal traditions, both ancient and medieval, and then argued to be more primitive than the others. By more primitive, he did not mean more barbarous, certainly not, but rather earlier in a pattern of legal evolution, an evolution that could be documented for Irish law, but often not for the laws with which he was comparing the Irish. That it did not mean more barbarous is evident from the example of sick maintenance, in which the Irish injurer's duty to do or to organise the actual nursing of his victim was certainly more human, if not necessarily more humane, than just paying for treatment by a doctor, as in the other legal traditions. In the case of sick maintenance, Binchy could, and indeed did, appeal directly to textual evidence. Another law tract, this time on status, which he would edit, Crith Gavlach, stated flatly, this sick maintenance does not exist nowadays. And this is a very rare instance of open acknowledgement of change in Irish law. A rather different example of Binchy's characteristic approach is found in one of his contributions to the volume Studies in Early Irish Law. This was not published until 1936, but it had started on its way when, for the first half of 1929, Thurneysen, who had come to Dublin at the invitation of the Royal Irish Academy, conducted a weekly seminar on the status of women and of various sexual unions. It began by editing and translating the main relevant tract, but participants also agreed to write up the results of their discussions. Binchy thus wrote on the legal capacity of women in regard to contracts. And in this chapter, he proposed, and I quote, to trace in the texts and commentaries, which I shall cite, a development parallel to that of other Indo-European systems. And he went on to arrange his sources in three classes, A, B, and C. A embraced those which did not allow women any independent capacity to make contracts. B, those which allowed a limited capacity. And C, those which allowed, and I quote, a much wider capacity. So the sources grouped under A all came from the old tracts of Irish law, not from glosses and commentaries. 5 out of the 6 placed under B came from the legal tract that the class had been reading with Thurneysen, but all therefore from old texts. The 5 grouped under C, however, included material from commentaries and were thus indisputably later in date. Binchy liked his Irish law much better when it changed than when it remained immutable. He may have studied law and politics as an undergraduate in UCD, but he shifted to history for the MA and for the doctorate in Munich. The attractions of studying law in terms of historical development and by the comparative method, in other words, by an approach familiar to scholars eminent in his student days, such as Joseph Parch and Paul Vinogradov, may partly have been that it joined together strands in his education, and because it made law part of human culture, always prone to change, not just a body of rules that might be authoritative in court at a given time, or just a profession in which one could make a good living. There is, however, a potential danger in broad theories of historical change of this kind, a danger that has been termed wiggery, after the early 19th century Whig Party in Britain. Namely, the notion that society is changing in one direction, from barbarism to civilization. Civilization being a condition of being like us, the Whigs, or whatever group to which the speaker or writer happened to belong. Now, this is an ancient tendency, going back long before the Whigs, and nicely exemplified by the remarks of Gerald of Wales on Irish society in the 12th century, and I quote from O'Mara's translation of the Topography of Ireland. "They are a wild and inhospitable people." I don't think he thought inhospitable, but anyway, he said it. "They live on beasts only and live like beasts. They have not progressed at all from the primitive habits of pastoral living. While man usually progresses from the woods to the fields, and from the fields to settlements and communities of citizens, this people despises work on the land, has little use for the money-making of towns, contemns the rights and privileges of citizenship, and desires neither to abandon nor to lose respect for the life which it has been accustomed to lead in the woods and countryside." The standard to which Gerald appealed and by which the Irish were deemed barbarous was, of course, the society he had known as a student in Paris, and which he also knew in southern England. Binchy's career in the study of early Irish law can, I think, be divided into three. From the time he took up the study of the subject and until 1940, he was the junior partner of Rudolf Thurneysen. From Thurneysen's death in 1940 until the late 1960s, he was on his own. From the academic year 1968 to 9, when he gave a seminar on the law tract Judgments on Neighbourhood, he at last had heirs in whose hands the subject would carry on. In the first phase, when he was junior partner to Thurneysen, belonged not just his work on sick maintenance, but his edition of the most detailed legal tract on status, Crich Govlach, published as volume 11 of the Medieval Modern Irish series in 1941, the year after Thurneysen had died. This tract was not part of the Seanchas Mór and was not provided with an apparatus of glosses and commentaries. Instead, it was almost all prose of the early 8th century. So, Crich Govlach was a text which, for most of my generation, gave us our first direct experience of Irish law in the original language. It was, I think, very well edited by Binchy, with no translation, one already existed by MacNeill, but with an almost complete vocabulary, not too common in that series, so very helpful for the student. And best of all, for those wanting to understand the law as well as to read Old Irish, a legal glossary in which Binchy gave excellent summaries of the meaning of important terms. A former colleague of mine in Oxford, James Campbell, who specialized on Anglo-Saxon history, bought a copy, even though he couldn't read a word of the Irish text, just for the sake of the legal glossary. Even in this early period, however, and even after he'd returned from his time as Irish minister in Berlin, Binchy did not confine himself to early Irish law. First, he wrote several important articles in the quarterly journal Studies on leading figures in German public life when he was still in Berlin, in the years preceding Hitler gaining power. Later, in 1937, he was commissioned by the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, to write Church and State in Fascist Italy, a long book of 774 pages that was published in 1941, the very same year in which Kriegskowrak appeared. He once told me that if he had had a deeper knowledge of the subject, namely the relations between the modern Italian state and the church, he could have written a shorter book. In terms of publications, Church and State in Fascist Italy was the final culmination of Binchy, the diplomat and contemporary historian. But in terms of personal engagement, this was not so. By 1941, of course, Europe was again at war. And although Ireland, apart from the 6 counties, was formally neutral, Binchy was not, and went to work for the research arm of the British Foreign Office, then housed in Oxford, specialising naturally on fascist Italy. In that way, he came to know and be known in the university. And after the war, the retirement of Sir Robert Ensor from his senior research fellowship in Corpus Christi College was followed by the college advertising for a successor, and Binchy, perhaps encouraged by the knowledge that it had been the college of Plummer and Vinogradov, applied. You have before you in the handout the record in the minutes of the governing body of the college for the 19th of January 1946 of the work that Binchy proposed to do as Senior Research Fellow. I quote, Mr. Binchy proposes 1. A continuation of his researches on Celtic law with a view to producing eventually a standard edition of the Irish legal material based on all the extant manuscripts, in effect a corpus juris Hibernici. B, a general study of Celtic law, Welsh and Irish, within the framework of Indo-European institutions. 2, a general study of the development of the modernist movement within the Roman Catholic Church, seen in perspective against the political, ecclesiastical, and spiritual background of our time. Binchy was to begin working in Oxford in October 1946. Yet, as with many such proposals, achievement did not entirely match aspiration. 1A, as we know, appeared in 1978 as the 6 volumes of the Corpus Juris Hibernici. 1B did not appear as a book, but what would have been particular chapters appeared as the O'Donnell Lectures for 1967-8, Celtic and Anglo-Saxon Kingship, and as papers on Celtic suretyship and distraint in Irish law. Number 2, the study of the modernist movement in the Catholic Church, did not appear at all. I suspect that was given up when Binchy returned to Dublin in 1949 to the Institute here. Anyway, Most importantly, the Senior Research Fellowship gave him time to get the Corpus Juris Hibernici underway. This was, after all, a huge and intimidating project. The main symptom of its beginnings in Oxford are that much of the first volume is given over to two Oxford manuscripts containing Irish law alongside other material. When Binchy began planning the corpus, he had, as he told me, a possible model in mind in Felix Liebermann's edition of Anglo-Saxon law. When a text existed in more than one manuscript, Liebermann printed their texts in parallel, together with a translation, all in his first volume. That first volume was followed by others containing a full vocabulary, a legal commentary, and glossaries, something like the legal glossary in Binchy's Chris Covloch. But to the entirety of the Anglo-Saxon and early Anglo-Norman texts. Now, to provide a counterpart for early Irish law would indeed have been a quite wonderful achievement. And some disappointed reactions to the final publication in 1978 showed that just such a wonderful achievement was what they were anticipating, but didn't get. But Binchy very quickly realized that he could not provide an Irish counterpart to Liebermann's Anglo-Saxon laws. First, the material was very considerably more extensive, even though about half the Seanchas Mar had survived only in extracts, if that. Secondly, and without any disrespect to colleagues working on Old English texts, the prose language was their material was far easier than Old Irish. Thirdly, Liebermann's edition was not the first scholarly edition and translation of the Anglo-Saxon laws. The effect was that where Liebermann could build a palace for students of Anglo-Saxon law that they have gratefully inhabited ever since, Binchy had to be content with building just the foundations. Yet, to content oneself with building the foundations implies a firm hope that others will come along to build the palace itself. That is why the problem of scholarly isolation became acute. This was the reason, as he told me, why Binchy decided to leave Oxford and return to Dublin, where he believed he was more likely to find an heir to carry on the study of early Irish law. For someone in his position, producing the Corpus Juris Hibernici was only part of the job. The other part was to bring on younger scholars so that they could carry on when the teacher died. Yet, throughout the 1950s and most of the 1960s, namely, most of the time that Binchy continued to work on those 6 volumes, no one who met Binchy's admittedly very high standards appeared to carry on the work. And that threatened to leave the Corpus Juris to me a mere relic of useless labour. The threat of this happening may well be the main reason why, as Binchy wrote in the introduction to the Corpus Juris, Miles Dillon, his colleague and friend, was somewhat sceptical of its value, holding that I would be far more usefully employed in editing or re-editing with translation and notes, some of the chief law tracts. Binchy did, however, get help, above all from Anne O'Sullivan, wife of William O'Sullivan, keeper of manuscripts in Trinity. In the 7 years 1968 to 75, she checked Binchy's proofs against the manuscripts, many of which were in the care of her husband. By the time Binchy died, on the 4th of May 1989, the first 2 volumes in the Early Irish Law series had been published, both editions of texts, and also the 3rd volume, Fergus Kelly's Guide to Early Irish Law, which from then on has been the gateway into the subject. So Binchy must have died knowing that his Corpus Juris Hibernici was indeed the foundation for a building, one that we can now see has been expanding steadily ever since. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a splendid overview of 3 outstanding scholars and their contribution to early Irish law and the study of early Irish law and its contextualization. We have a few minutes, and Thomas very kindly agreed to take some questions, if questions there are. Yes, Fountain.
Thank you, Thomas. I've seen the digital scans of Binchy's copies of Ancient Laws of Ireland from Toronto. So he has a lot of notes on it, correcting translations in the first few volumes and some of the parallel text. Did he inherit those also from Charles Plummer's previous work as well? No.
The funny thing is that although he would have benefited considerably, he didn't know they existed. Oh, so sad. No, so much extra work that didn't really need to be done.
Thank you. So, Brian.
Just wondering, you mentioned Anne O'Sullivan there. Is there any evidence to suggest that she might possibly have been taken on by Binchy as somebody who would have worked? I know she was working on the dictionary in the academy, but she had an excellent pedigree in terms of already producing academic work herself. Is there any suggestion, or have you seen any evidence that she perhaps, they seem to have got on quite well?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think he saw her as a future expert in early Irish law. But because of who she was, her experience, the fact that she was the wife of William O'Sullivan, was a very kind person to people working, people working on Irish things. She was excellent for the purpose. I mean, that's someone who just fitted that particular place.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the talk. Something that has struck me is the failure of the state in the early years of the state to organise a project essentially akin to a Bretton Laws Commission too, and why it was left solely, if you like, in the hands of the chancellors of academia, if you like, later in Corpus Juris and so on. How come we didn't see it earlier under a more organised, state-backed procedure, shall we say? Do you get the sense from anything you've seen around Binchy, etc., like he also may have lamented that, or had any particular views on that his work may have been accelerated if it had been supported or prompted earlier by state authorities here?
I think when he was working on this stuff, he was acutely aware that nobody else had the preparation to offer serious assistance. And this was a period when major pieces of scholarly work were typically individual productions, I mean, our current period, when so much of it is a matter of a project team, as it were, doing the work, that's very foreign to, when I was a young man. Never much liked it ever since. But obviously, links are important because I'm not sure whether I got it across, but Parch, I think, is critical for the whole thing. So it's Parch that gets Thurneysen working on early Irish law. It's then the publication of that first tract that Thurneysen edited, which makes Plummer tell Vinogradov that something is now being produced which people like Vinogradov really can use, because they failed to make much use of the ancient laws. And then, of course, that means that when Vinogradov meets Binchy in Paris, he tells him, come on, this is what you can do. So there's a rather nice link. But Parch, great man, I think.
Sorry, Edad.
One person that you mentioned along the way was Owen McNeil.
Yeah.
Where did he fit in, or was Binchy too young to have any contact? I mean, McNeil, I'm trying to think when McNeil died.
45.
45, yeah.
Yeah.
He continued.
Oh, yes. Well, he had a phase of working on Irish law, when in fact he was in jail.
Yes, yeah.
So he must have been let out of jail before he published that excellent piece in the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy on the status of franchise and the translation of Greek Gothic, etc., other things. So, yeah, for a period, and that's why the early 1920s is such a particular period, because there was him too. I mean, I had three, and I wanted to talk about them because they were long-term students. But I suppose that's slightly unfair to McNeil, because after all, he published a more popular book, Early Irish Laws and Institutions, whatever, later. But that's never been particularly important.
There aren't any more questions. Just one last announcement before we thank our speaker once again. We will have the last lecture this year on the 25th, that's a fortnight from today. Professor Patrick Sims-Williams, Professor Emeritus in Aberystwyth University, will speak to us, will give the Miles Dillon Memorial Lecture, England in a Bedra, and it will be here on the Institute at 5 o'clock. So I hope to see many of you here again. Sorry, you have a question?
Sorry, just will that lecture be recorded?
Will Professor Sims-Williams?
Yes.
I better ask my boss, Eileen, about that. Not fully sure, but probably, yes. So it just remains for us to thank Thomas once again for a splendid lecture. And before doing so, I'd like to invite you downstairs afterwards, after the half an hour's applause, for a glass of wine or something weaker than that. So thank you.